They said life wasn't fair, and they were right. My parents chose my sister's dream over mine, left me with nothing but a suitcase and a storm. I built my future from that rain, brick by brick, contract by contract. And the day she showed up for an interview at my company, I smiled and asked, "Do you believe fairness is something we earn?" Her silence was my answer. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The smell of roasted chicken filled the house that Friday night, but it couldn't hide the tension sitting at our table. My father, Edward Morgan, sat at the head like always, his posture stiff, his knife and fork moving in precise lines. My mother, Margaret, kept refilling his glass, her smile practiced bright but hollow. Lauren sat across from me, her long hair perfect, her expression glowing with the confidence of someone who knew she belonged. I sat at the far end, a half-empty plate and a lump in my throat. Dad cleared his throat. Lauren got her acceptance letter today. University of Michigan Law. Full scholarship. He said it like a business announcement, not pride, not warmth, just fact. Mom's hand landed over Lauren's eyes, shining. "We always knew you'd do great things." Lauren smiled, polite, almost embarrassed. "Thanks, Dad. Thanks, Mom." I waited for a pause that never came. I held my letter tighter under the table, the corners bending in my palm. Finally, I said I got accepted too. Ohio State, supply chain management. They offered me a partial scholarship. I forced a smile. It's a good program. Dad didn't even look up from his plate. "That's nice, Claire. But be realistic. Lauren's program will open doors. You might want to think about working part-time, get some real-world skills," Mom added without missing a beat. "You've always been good with your hands, maybe something practical. You don't want to take on loans you can't pay back." The words hit like soft punches, nothing sharp enough to bleed, but deep enough to bruise. I looked at Lauren, hoping for something, any defense, but she just lowered her eyes. The silence stretched thick and awkward. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. I nodded once. "Sure, practical." My voice barely rose above a whisper. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping against the hardwood floor. "I'll do the dishes." No one stopped me. I carried the plates to the sink, the clatter of porcelain filling the space their words had left empty. My reflection wavered in the kitchen window. Thin, quiet, forgettable. After dinner, I went upstairs. Their voices drifted through the vent near my door. Dad. "She doesn't have the drive Lauren does. Mom." "I know. Claire's different. She's sensitive, but life doesn't reward sensitive." Dad's voice softened, almost pitying. "She'll be fine. She's not meant for big things." I sat on the floor beside my bed, knees pulled to my chest, their words echoing like static. On my desk lay the letter from Ohio State, the seal still crisp proof that someone out there thought I could do more than they did. I opened my notebook and wrote in shaky handwriting, "Fairness is something we earn." Then I underlined it twice. Downstairs, laughter erupted, loud, careless. Mom said something about Lauren's future. Dad chuckled in that low that filled the walls. The sound crept up through the floorboards, settling around me like cold air. I lay back on the carpet, staring at the ceiling fan, turning slow circles. My throat ached, but no tears came. There was no space for them. I listened to the rhythm of their voices, the home that belonged to everyone except me. When I finally turned off the lamp, the room went dark except for the glow from the hallway under the door. For a second, I imagined walking out, telling them I would prove them wrong. But the words stayed locked behind my teeth. Instead, I whispered to the quiet, "One day I'll earn it." The laughter downstairs faded, replaced by the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of pipes, the small sounds of a house that no longer felt like mine. I closed my eyes and let the silence settle in. The rain started in the afternoon, the kind that turned the sky into a sheet of dull gray. I sat by my bedroom window, my acceptance letter from Ohio State still open on my desk. But this time, there was something new. A second envelope. The return address read, Office of Financial Aid. My hands trembled as I opened it. "Congratulations," it began. "We're pleased to offer you an additional scholarship." It wasn't full, but it was enough. Enough to make it real. I didn't even think. I just grabbed the letter and ran downstairs, heart pounding, hair still damp from the drizzle outside. "Dad," I said breathlessly, stepping into the living room. "They increased my scholarship. I only need a small amount now, just enough to cover books and living expenses. I can work part-time to handle the rest." He didn't look up from his newspaper. The sound of the pages turning was louder than my voice. "Claire," he said, his tone steady, unbothered. "We've talked about this. We can't afford 2 tuitions. But this isn't like before," I insisted, holding the paper toward him. "It's mostly covered. I've done everything right. I just need—" He folded the paper neatly, set it aside, and looked at me for the first time. "You're 18 now. You need to start learning how to be independent." I froze. The words were calm but final. Mom's voice came from the kitchen, soft and casual, as if she were commenting on the weather. "Your father's right, honey. We don't want to spread ourselves thin. Lauren's tuition is already a stretch." I turned toward her. She was on the phone, still smiling as she said to someone, "Yes, Lauren's going to Michigan Law. We're so proud." Then she set the phone down and opened her purse. "Here." She pulled out a worn $20 bill and pressed it into my hand, "just in case you need something." Something in my chest cracked. $20. My voice came out smaller than I wanted. Mom gave a soft sigh, the kind that ended every argument before it began. "Don't make this harder, Claire. You'll be fine. You've always been resourceful." Lauren appeared in the doorway, her eyes full of guilt. She whispered, "I'm sorry." I looked at her. The perfect daughter, the one who never had to ask for permission to dream, and for the first time I felt nothing. Dad's voice cut through the silence. "Your sister will do greater things." That was it. The conversation was over. He picked up his paper again, and I could hear the rustle of the pages as he turned back to the world that didn't include me. I went upstairs. The house felt too quiet, too clean. I pulled out my old duffel bag from under the bed and started packing 2 pairs of jeans, a sweater, my notebook, my acceptance letters. That was all I had that mattered. When I zipped the bag, it made a sound that felt like an ending. Downstairs, the smell of coffee drifted through the air. I could hear my parents' muffled laughter. I stood at the top of the stairs for a moment, watching them through the banister. Lauren sitting between them, their world intact, mine erased. Then I walked out the front door. The rain was colder than I expected, soaking through my jacket in seconds. My shoes splashed against the pavement as I made my way down Maple Avenue, past the old grocery store, the gas station, the streetlight that always flickered. By the time I reached the bus stop, the street was empty. The bench was slick with rain. I set my bag beside me and sat down. My hands were shaking too hard to hold the letter anymore. The ink had already started to blur. I leaned back against the cold metal shelter and closed my eyes. They chose her future over mine, and just like that, I stopped being their daughter and became a shadow of the one they wanted. Cars passed their headlights, sweeping across the wet road. The rain beat harder, soaking through my jeans, dripping into my collar. My stomach twisted. Fear, hunger, exhaustion. I couldn't tell which anymore. I tried to imagine what independence was supposed to feel like. Was it supposed to feel like this? Alone, wet, invisible, somewhere between the sound of the rain and the hum of tires on asphalt. I started whispering to myself, "You'll be fine. You'll find a way." But the words didn't sound convincing even to me. Time blurred. I don't know how long I sat there. My fingers went numb. My head felt light, like the world was slipping away in slow motion. A car turned the corner headlights, cutting through the storm. I squinted, trying to see. The light hit me straight in the face, bright and harsh. For a moment, I thought maybe it was my parents, that they'd realized their mistake, that they'd come to bring me home. But the car didn't stop. It passed, leaving a splash of dirty water in its wake. I pressed my palm against the $20 bill in my pocket, now damp and soft from the rain. "This is all the proof they think I need to survive," I whispered. The streetlight above me flickered once, then twice before going dark. The last thing I remember was the sound of thunder rolling in the distance and the glow of another set of headlights approaching, slowing down this time. Then everything faded into black. When I opened my eyes, the world was white and humming. The ceiling lights buzzed faintly, and for a second I thought I'd died and woken up inside the sound of static. My throat burned when I tried to breathe. A soft beep kept rhythm with my pulse. "You're awake," a gentle voice said. A woman leaned over me, mid-40s, tired eyes, but kind. Her name tag read Ellen Hart, RN. I tried to speak, but all that came out was a rasp. She poured water into a cup and held it to my lips. Easy, she said. You've been out for almost a day. Fever, dehydration, mild pneumonia. You're lucky someone found you when they did. Someone found me. I blinked, trying to piece things together. The rain, the bus stop, the lights. Who, I croaked. She smiled faintly like she knew the answer meant more to me than it should. A man called the police. Said he saw you collapse. He waited until the ambulance came, made sure you were taken care of. Did he? I started, but my chest hurt when I spoke. Ellen nodded toward the small table beside my bed. He left that. A white envelope sat there, sealed, a faint crease down the middle. My hands shook when I reached for it. Inside was a single $20 bill, pressed flat dry like it had never seen the rain. A small note was folded around it, written in careful block letters, "Keep this. You'll need it more than I do. No name, no signature." I stared at the words until they blurred. Ellen adjusted my IV line. He said someone once helped him the same way. Didn't want any thanks. Just asked us to make sure you were okay. I swallowed hard. How bad was it? Your body temperature was dangerously low, she said softly. You were hypothermic. If he hadn't stopped, it might have been too late. For a moment, I couldn't look at her. My fingers tightened around the envelope, the thin paper crinkling under my touch. What's my bill? I asked finally. Ellen hesitated. It's already been paid. By him. She nodded. I let out a shaky breath. Gratitude should have felt warm, but it stung instead, like I owed the world something I hadn't earned yet. She moved closer, tucking the blanket around me. Rest. You'll need your strength if you want to leave tomorrow. When she walked away, the room fell silent, except for the slow beeping of the monitor. The machines hummed the kind of sound you stop hearing after a while, but that never truly leaves the air. I glanced down at the plastic band around my wrist. It read, Patient Claire Morgan, address unknown. I traced the letters with my thumb. Unknown. That's what I was now. A girl with no address, no home, no proof of belonging anywhere. The next morning, Ellen helped me sit up. She handed me a bundle of donated clothes. Jeans, a size too big, a gray sweatshirt, clean socks. We get them from the church down the street, she said. Not fancy, but they'll keep you warm. I thanked her, though the word felt too small for what she'd done. When I was ready to leave, she handed me a small brown paper bag with cough drops, a water bottle, and an apple. The weather's still rough out there. Take it slow. I hesitated before walking out. Ellen. She looked up from the chart she was filling. Can you tell him thank you? If he ever comes back, she smiled, shaking her head. Something tells me he wouldn't want me to. Outside, the world was gray and silver, washed clean by rain. The parking lot shimmered under the pale morning light. The cold hit me hard, but it wasn't cruel this time. It was sharp enough to make me feel alive. I stood there for a while, breathing in the scent of wet pavement, holding the envelope in my hand. I didn't know what to do next. I had no plan, no destination. Just $20 and a promise I hadn't made yet, but somehow already felt bound to keep. When I started walking, the city stretched ahead. Quiet, unfamiliar, but open. The streets were slick, the puddles reflecting the overcast sky like broken mirrors. I passed a laundromat, a thrift store, and a diner with a hand-painted sign that read, Ruth's Diner, home cooking since 1974. In the window, taped slightly crooked, was a bright yellow paper, help wanted, dishwashers needed. I stopped staring at it through the glass. Inside, a woman with gray-streaked hair wiped the counter. Her movements steady, unhurried. The bell above the door jingled as someone left, and the warm smell of coffee and bacon drifted out into the street. I pressed my fingers around the envelope until the edges dug into my skin. When no one owes you anything, you start owing life itself. I took a breath, squared my shoulders, and stepped toward the door. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside Ruth's Diner. The air hit me. Warm, thick, with the smell of coffee, bacon grease, and something fried. My shoes squeaked against the linoleum floor, still damp from the rain I'd tracked in. A woman with dark hair streaked with gray looked up from behind the counter, her hands still deep in soapy water. Her name tag read Ruth. You lost, sweetheart, she asked, her voice low and rich with a hint of Spanish accent. I swallowed. No, I saw your sign. I pointed toward the window. Help wanted. She gave me a slow once-over. My clothes didn't hide much. Thrift store jeans, sweatshirt too big, exhaustion too obvious. You ever waited tables before? I shook my head. No, ma'am. But I learned fast. Her lips twitched, not quite a smile. We all say that. You can start by washing dishes. Everybody starts with cold water. She nodded toward the swinging door behind her. Aprons are by the sink. Don't break anything you can't afford to replace. That was my interview. The kitchen was cramped, the floor sticky, the sink full of plates stacked like leaning towers. I rolled up my sleeves and plunged my hands into the cold, greasy water. It bit at the raw skin on my knuckles, but I kept going. Hours blurred together. The sound of plates clinking, the hiss of the grill, the low hum of old country music from the radio. By the end of my first shift, my back ached, and my fingers looked like they belonged to someone else. When I turned off the faucet, Ruth was leaning against the counter, arms crossed. "You didn't quit," she said simply. "I needed the job." I replied, "Everybody needs the job," she said, grabbing a towel. "But not everyone lasts till closing." She handed me a cup of coffee, black, no sugar. "Drink. It's on the house." It was bitter, but it was the best thing I'd tasted in weeks. The next days fell into rhythm, arrive before sunrise, scrub, serve, wipe, repeat. My hands cracked from the soap, my feet throbbed every night, but I didn't care. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't invisible. The customers were rough around the edges, truckers, mechanics, night shift workers, but they started remembering my name. "Morning Claire," one of them would say, and it sounded strange in my ears, like hearing myself exist again. Ruth kept her distance, but she watched everything. She didn't waste words. And when she did speak, people listened. "Don't rush the coffee," she'd say. "People pay for the pause, not the caffeine." Or, "Wipe the counter like it's your reflection. You respect it. It respects you." It didn't take long for me to realize Ruth's Diner wasn't just a place for food. It was a place where people like me started over. One night after the dinner rush died down, I was wiping the tables when I noticed the delivery truck pull up outside. I watched as the driver dropped off boxes and Ruth checked each one off her clipboard. There was a system to it, a pattern. Each box was labeled, each time stamped, each route following an invisible logic. When the door closed behind her, I pulled out my notebook and began writing. Delivery 7, 12 p.m. Same driver, same brand. 3 boxes of potatoes, 2 of coffee. Every third day. I sketched little arrows connecting them, trying to see how it all fit. I didn't hear Ruth come up behind me. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice not angry but curious. I shut the notebook too fast. "Sorry, I was just trying to figure out the pattern. If you reorganized the delivery times, you could probably cut a few hours off your wait time." Her eyebrows lifted. "You're telling me how to run my diner?" My stomach dropped. "No, She raised a hand, stopping me. Then she laughed, a deep, warm laugh that made her shoulders shake. "Relax, kid. I'm not gonna bite." She picked up the notebook from the counter, flipping through the pages. "You did all this from watching 2 deliveries." I nodded. She studied the messy handwriting, the arrows, the notes. "You got a head for systems," she said finally. "Better than my accountant, that's for sure." "I just like when things make sense," I said quietly. Her eyes softened for a second. "Keep that. The world's a mess. People like you keep it running." She handed back the notebook and turned off the lights over the counter. "Go home, Claire." "I don't really have one," I said before I could stop myself. Ruth paused in the doorway. "Then this'll do for now." She locked the door, flipped the sign to closed, and said over her shoulder, "Keep that habit of noticing things. One day it'll save you." When she left, I stood there in the dim light, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. My reflection stared back from the diner window, tired, a little broken, but real. For the first time since I'd left home, I didn't feel like a ghost. The bell over the diner door jingled just after sunrise, same as it did every morning. The smell of fresh coffee hung thick in the air, mixing with frying bacon, and the faint hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. I was stacking delivery boxes in the back when a deep voice called out, "Morning, Ruth. Got your produce." Ruth waved him in from behind the counter. "Back door." "Ben, Claire will help you unload." That was how I met Ben Foster. He was tall, built like someone used to lifting more than he should, his brown hair sticking out from under a faded Northline freight cap. When he saw me sorting the boxes, he grinned. "You always line them up by size. It saves space," I said, balancing one on top of another. "And time. You don't waste movement when you plan ahead." He laughed. "Never met anyone who cared this much about boxes." "Boxes are just patterns," I replied. "If you can see the pattern, you can fix the chaos." He looked at me a moment longer, then nodded like he understood something. "You sound like you should be working in logistics, not scrubbing coffee stains." "I used to study that," I said before I could stop myself. "Didn't finish. College, Ohio State." Ben whistled softly. Impressive. You ever think about getting back into it? I shrugged. I'm not exactly in a position to go back to school. He didn't push. He just smiled, the kind of easy, steady smile that didn't ask for anything. You know my company, Northline Freight. We're hiring data entry clerks. Nothing fancy, but it's a start. You'd fit right in. I looked at him, unsure if he was joking. I don't have a degree. Ben leaned against the truck, crossing his arms. You don't need paper to have brains. I can tell you've got both. I laughed under my breath. Compliments weren't something I'd heard much lately, and hearing one felt almost foreign. You don't even know me. I know organization when I see it, he said. And I know people who get things done. For the first time in months, someone said I could be more than what I'd settled for. Over the next few weeks, he came every morning, always around the same time, his truck rattling down the alley like clockwork. I'd have the back door open and a pot of coffee ready by the time he arrived. We worked side by side in quiet rhythm, the kind that didn't need words. Sometimes we talked about his roots, the back roads outside Portland, the mountain passes that froze in winter. Other times about things that didn't matter, songs on the radio, how Ruth's coffee was too strong to be legal, how he missed his dog back home in Eugene. He started calling me Maps because I once rearranged his crates in route order without asking. You've got a head for patterns. Maps, he'd say, and I pretended to hate the nickname. Ruth noticed. One morning after Ben left, she wiped her hands on a towel and looked at me over her glasses. You trust him? I hesitated. He's decent. Her lips curled into a knowing smile. That's rare enough. Then after a pause, if he offers you something better, you take it. I don't know, I said quietly. I've got a job here. You've got a starting point here, she corrected. Not a finish line. Don't get too comfortable, Claire. Comfort's the killer of fairness. It makes you forget what you deserve. She walked back to the counter, leaving her words hanging in the air like steam from the coffee pots. That afternoon, while sweeping the floor, I found Ben's business card tucked under a delivery slip. He'd written on the back in blue ink, "Call me if you want to build something that moves." I stared at it for a long time, tracing the smudge of his thumbprint in the corner. The idea of leaving scared me more than it should have. Ruth's Diner was the first place that had felt even remotely safe. I knew the smell of it, the rhythm of it, the sound of Ruth's laugh echoing through the kitchen at closing time. But safety wasn't the same as purpose. The next morning, Ben came earlier than usual. I was already at the back door waiting. You're early, I said. So are you. He replied. Guess we're both planning ahead. He reached into his pocket and pulled out another card. Clean this time. There's an opening. Data entry. I told my supervisor about you. I blinked. You what? He shrugged. Told him you're smart. That you see the big picture. He said to have you call HR this week. My chest tightened. You didn't have to do that. Didn't have to. He said, but I wanted to. When he left, I stood in the alley behind the diner card in hand, the morning light catching the edges of the print. Northline Freight. A new name. A new door. That night after closing, I told Ruth. She didn't look surprised. Northline Freight, she repeated, nodding. Good company, hard work but fair. You'll do fine. I chewed my lip. I don't know if I'm ready. Ruth wiped her hands turned off the fryer and faced me. Nobody's ever ready, Claire. You just start walking before the ground catches up. I smiled faintly. You make it sound simple. It is, she said. Simple doesn't mean easy. Before locking up, she leaned against the doorway, her voice softer now. If you go, remember this fairness only finds the ones who aren't afraid to start over. I nodded, words stuck in my throat. I looked around the diner one last time. The cracked vinyl booths, the old neon sign humming faintly in the window, the smell of coffee that had seeped into the walls. I didn't cry. I just breathed in, slow, memorizing everything. Then I turned toward the door, the sound of the rain starting again outside. I left the first place that ever called me by my name to find out if that name could mean something more. The first thing that hit me at Northline Freight was the noise. Engines groaning in the yard, forklifts, beeping men shouting over the crackle of radios. It sounded like organized chaos. The smell of diesel clung to everything from the concrete floor to the metal stairs leading up to the offices. I stood there holding my resume, feeling like a misplaced puzzle piece in a picture too big for me. A tall man in a button-down rolled to his elbows came out of an office, coffee mug in hand. Claire Morgan, he called. Yes, sir. Tom Whitaker, he said, extending his hand. Operations manager. Come on in. His office was small, but the walls were lined with maps, routes marked in different colors, sticky notes everywhere. It looked like the inside of someone's brain who never stopped thinking about roads. He sat down flipping through my one-page resume. No college degree. Not yet, I admitted, but I know how to read freight maps, organize inventory, and track deliveries. I worked at a diner that handled daily supplier routes. I built a system for them that saved about 4 hours a week. Tom raised an eyebrow, amused. You're telling me you optimized a diner? I smiled. They sold more coffee because of it, he chuckled. You've got 90 days to prove you belong here, Claire. Think you can handle that? I can handle more than that, I said. He nodded, once handed me a clipboard, and gestured toward the warehouse below. Welcome to the mess. Those first weeks were brutal. The days started before sunrise, and sometimes ended long after the trucks left the yard. I learned the rhythm of the place. The sharp ring of loading bay doors, the scratch of pens on manifests, the coffee that always tasted burnt but kept everyone upright. Tom gave me the grunt work. Data entry, route logs, fuel receipts. I didn't complain. I stayed late, checking every number twice. I built spreadsheets, color-coded routes, and tracked delays against weather data pulled from free websites. When drivers called in sick, I covered their shifts on dispatch. One evening, Tom stopped by my desk as I was recalculating route times. You're still here, he said, leaning on the doorframe. Almost done, I said without looking up. He studied me for a second, then said, Most people do the job to survive. You do it to fix things. Maybe both. I answered. He nodded. Keep at it. Months passed. I stopped being the new girl and became Morgan, the one who could find a shipment faster than the GPS. When routes went wrong, people came to me. I learned to predict delays before they happened. Snowstorms in the passes, bridge closures, overworked drivers who'd push a little too far. Fairness doesn't come from pity. It comes from what you build when no one's looking. After a year, Tom pulled me aside. We're hemorrhaging money on fuel. I want a proposal by next month to cut costs. Think you can handle that? I said yes before I even knew how. For weeks, I buried myself in spreadsheets and shipping maps. I followed every route, every mile. I started noticing patterns. Duplicate stops, detours, wasted fuel on routes that crossed each other like tangled threads. One night, while the office was empty, I spread everything across the floor. Papers, maps, sticky notes. I grabbed a red marker and started drawing. Lines, circles, arrows. By the time the sun came up, I had a new system. At the next operations meeting, I walked into the room clutching my charts. Tom sat at the head of the table beside a man I didn't recognize, a silver-haired investor in a navy suit, his expression unreadable. Mr. Brooks. Tom said, motioning toward him. He's here representing the board. I presented my plan. New routes, real-time reporting predictive fuel usage. My hands shook, but my voice stayed even. When I finished, the room was quiet. The man in the suit leaned forward. 12% projected savings. Yes, sir, I said, based on current mileage and rate of returns. He tapped his pen on the table. How old are you? Miss Morgan, 23. A slow smile crossed his face. Ambitious. He looked at Tom. Hire more like her. Tom grinned. She's already here, Daniel. The name hit me like a sudden memory. The man Ellen had mentioned at the hospital, the one with gray hair who'd paid my bill, who'd left the $20 bill in the envelope. My heart stuttered, but I kept my face still. After the meeting, I lingered by the conference room door. Daniel Brooks was the last to leave. He turned toward me, extending his hand. You've got potential, he said. If you ever come up with something bigger than this, something that changes how the business runs, call me. I took his hand. His grip was steady, familiar somehow. Maybe I will, I said softly. As he walked away, I watched him go. The echo of his steps fading down the hallway. Part of me wanted to tell him who I was, that he'd saved my life once, that his $20 had carried me farther than he could imagine. But I didn't. Not yet. Because now, for the first time, I was earning something on my own. The smell of instant noodles and printer ink filled my apartment that summer. Papers covered every inch of the small kitchen table. Route maps, shipping invoices, spreadsheets, and a half-sketched logo that read Morgan Logistics. The only clear spot was the corner where my coffee mug sat cold for the third time that day. I'd quit Northline Freight 3 months earlier. It was reckless, maybe even stupid. But something in me couldn't ignore the thought that kept echoing in my head. If systems could be built for others, they could be built for me. When Daniel Brooks showed up that evening, I almost didn't answer the door. He was standing in the hallway, wearing his usual navy suit, holding a folder under one arm. "I figured this is where the magic happens," he said, stepping past me before I could invite him in. His eyes swept across the mess of papers, the maps taped to the walls. "Looks like you've been busy." I crossed my arms, trying to build something. He smiled, setting the folder on the table. "That's why I'm here. You've got the brains, Claire. I've got the capital. We could make this official." I frowned. "You mean a partnership?" "Exactly. I'll put up the money. You handle the operations." He tapped the folder. "Contracts, projections, bank setup. Everything legit." My pulse quickened. "Why me?" "Because you understand movement," he said. "Most people see trucks. You see systems. I like systems." For a moment, the noise of the city outside, the cars, the sirens, the distant music, faded. I thought about Ruth's diner, about the first time someone had trusted me enough to hand me a set of keys. I reached for the folder. "All right," I said finally. "Let's do it." 2 weeks later, Morgan Logistics Group was born. The headquarters was a warehouse Daniel had leased on the industrial side of Portland. The paint peeled off the walls, the roof leaked when it rained, and the office furniture was secondhand. But it was ours, or so I believed. We started with 3 employees, me, a dispatcher named Carla, and a driver who smoked too much but never missed a delivery. I worked 12-hour days, sometimes more, juggling client calls, routing software, and payroll spreadsheets. When the heat from the computers got unbearable, I'd tie my hair back, roll my sleeves up, and keep going. The first contract came from a small chain of grocery stores that needed refrigerated deliveries between Portland and Salem. It wasn't much, but the first time I signed a client under the name Morgan Logistics, I felt something shift inside me. Pride, maybe, or the ghost of it. Daniel visited often, always smiling, always charming. He'd stand by the whiteboard as I explained projections and say things like, "You've got real potential, Claire. With the right push, you could be running 10 times this." But he also asked questions that bothered me. "What's our cash position? How much is in the account? Do you have access to all vendor payments?" I brushed it off. He was the investor, after all. He had a right to know. Or that's what I told myself. At night, when the office went dark, I stayed behind typing reports on my old laptop, watching the numbers slowly turn from red to black. There was satisfaction in the grind. The way systems clicked together, the way chaos turned into order. Still, there was fear too. Fear that I'd built something that could be taken away just as easily. One afternoon, I met with a lawyer named Jordan Hayes, referred by a friend from Northline. He was in his mid-30s, sharp suit, calm voice, the kind of person who noticed everything. He flipped through our partnership contract, his brow furrowing. "He owns 51%, Jordan said. "Daniel." "Yes, he put up most of the funding," I explained. "That means he controls it. He can outvote you on every decision. He can sell the company without your consent." I felt my stomach tighten. He wouldn't do that. Jordan leaned back. "You seem smart, Claire. I'm not saying don't trust him. I'm saying protect yourself." When I told Daniel later that I'd had a lawyer review the documents, his expression barely changed. "Smart move," he said, smiling. "Always good to have someone watching your back." But something flickered behind his eyes. A shadow of irritation gone as quickly as it came. Weeks passed. The company grew faster than I expected. We added new clients, bought another truck, hired 2 more drivers. Every signature, every check, every phone call carried my name. People started saying it, writing it, calling me Miss Morgan with respect I hadn't felt since I was a kid. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath my feet wasn't entirely mine. One night, long after everyone had gone home, I stayed to reconcile invoices. The warehouse was quiet, the hum of the fridge units echoing like a heartbeat. My email pinged. A message from Daniel forwarded by mistake. The subject line read, "Potential buyout opportunity." I opened it. He'd attached a document outlining Morgan Logistics' valuation, projected sale price, and a note that said, "Existing founder manageable. Consider equity reduction strategy." I stared at the words until my eyes blurred. The office lights buzzed overhead. The air felt heavy, like the whole building was leaning in to hear what I'd do next. For a long moment, I did nothing. Then I clicked download. Saved the file to a private folder and closed the screen. I opened my notebook, the same one I'd carried since the diner, and wrote one line across the page, "Fairness isn't given. It's tested." Then I underlined it twice and turned off the lights. 2 years later, the office didn't look anything like the old warehouse we started in. The walls were painted white now, maps of the western states framed and mounted in neat rows. Every morning, sunlight poured through the glass windows, bouncing off the polished desks, where 20 employees tapped on keyboards, their chatter blending with the hum of the printers. Morgan Logistics had grown fast, $5 million in revenue, new clients from California to Washington, and a staff that believed in what we were building. It should have felt like victory. Instead, that morning, an envelope on my desk told me otherwise. It was thick, formal, stamped with the words, "Notice of Civil Action." I opened it slowly, my pulse tightening as I read. Daniel Brooks was suing me for breach of contract, claiming I'd mismanaged funds, violated investor agreements, and jeopardized company assets. He wanted full control of Morgan Logistics. I read the letter twice before setting it down. The room around me blurred for a second. Carla knocked on my office door holding her coffee. "You okay, boss?" I managed a nod. "Yeah, just paperwork." When she left, I called Jordan. He arrived an hour later, sleeves rolled up, legal pad under his arm. "So he's finally showing his hand," he said, after skimming the complaint. "He wants everything," I said quietly. Jordan looked up at me. "He's bluffing. You still have that email, the buyout proposal." I nodded. "And all the attachments." "Good," he said. "Then we fight." The next 6 months became a blur of court filings, depositions, and meetings that stretched late into the night. Daniel's lawyers were ruthless, sharp suits, sharper smiles. They painted me as reckless, unqualified, too emotional to run a business. The headlines followed. Young CEO faces, legal turmoil, Morgan Logistics under fire. My picture appeared beside words I never said. Every morning I came into the office anyway. I smiled for my team. I made the coffee myself. I drove to meet clients who hesitated to renew contracts. Some refused. Some stayed, saying, "We believe in you, not the press." One night after another hearing, I drove myself to a client meeting in Eugene. Rain hammered the windshield as I pushed through miles of dark highway. Somewhere along the way, the fear turned into fuel. Fairness isn't quiet. It's work that keeps moving even when no one believes you deserve to. Back at the office, Jordan kept me grounded. "He's overplaying," he said one afternoon, dropping a folder on my desk. "We'll counterclaim fraudulent misrepresentation." I smiled faintly. "You make it sound easy. It's not," he said. "But neither are you. We won the preliminary hearing. The judge allowed our counterclaim, and suddenly the headlines softened. Investors started calling again, asking for meetings, but I wasn't celebrating. I was tired in a way that no amount of coffee could fix. It was during that exhaustion that another piece of news found me. I was scrolling through financial reports late one night when an article caught my eye. Morgan Industrial, a long-standing family manufacturing firm in Ohio, files for bankruptcy after years of mismanagement. The name hit me like a cold wind. Morgan Industrial, my father's company. I clicked on the article. The details were brutal. Tax debt, license revoked, dozens of layoffs. My father, once known for his precision and control, now facing public collapse. 10 years ago, they told me they couldn't afford 2 futures. Now they owed the world for the one they chose. I stared at the screen until my reflection appeared in the dark glass. My hair tied back, my eyes older than I remembered. Somewhere between the noise of the lawsuit and the silence of that moment, I realized something simple. Fairness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. A few weeks later, Jordan walked into my office with a folder marked "Confidential." "There's something you might want to see," he said, laying it on my desk. Inside was a proposal from the state of Ohio, a government contract to help restructure small logistics and industrial firms in financial distress. One of the listed companies was Morgan Industrial. "They're applying for consultant bids," Jordan said. "You could take it. It's good money. Full discretion." I closed the folder slowly. "They have no idea who runs Morgan Logistics, do they?" He smiled. "Nope." I sat there for a long moment, the sound of the office humming faintly around me. The printer clicked. Outside, someone laughed. Finally, I said, "Submit the bid." Jordan nodded. "You sure?" "Yes." When the approval came through 2 weeks later, I signed the contract myself. The state documents called me Executive Director, Morgan Logistics Group. My father would have to read that name eventually. On the day of the first meeting, I wore the same gray blazer I'd worn to my first Northline interview. The conference room was sterile white walls and fluorescent lights. Across the table sat the representatives from Morgan Industrial. 3 men and a woman, all anxious, all polite. My father wasn't there. Neither was my mother. One of the men, an old family acquaintance, smiled nervously. "Miss Morgan, thank you for taking this on. We really need help getting the company back on its feet." I returned the smile. "That's what we do. We fix what's broken." The meeting lasted an hour. When it ended, I gathered my papers, shook hands, and walked outside into the Portland air. The sky was the color of steel rain, threatening but not yet falling. I looked up and whispered to no one in particular. Maybe fairness doesn't have to knock. Maybe it just waits until you build the door yourself. Then I walked back to my car, the new contract folder under my arm, the company name, Morgan Industrial, printed neatly beside mine. The room smelled like old paper and coffee that had been sitting too long. The walls of Morgan Industrial's boardroom were lined with faded photographs, black and white shots of machines and workers from a time when the company still meant something. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, too bright against the dust. I stood by the window, reviewing the contract one last time. The pages were clean, efficient, everything in place. The logo at the top. Morgan Logistics Group seemed to pulse under the light like it knew what was about to happen. The door opened. I heard the shuffle of shoes. Before I saw him, my father walked in the same deliberate stride I remembered from childhood, measured, controlled, never uncertain. His hair had gone almost white and his shoulders curved slightly forward, but his expression hadn't changed. Behind him trailed two managers, both trying to hide their unease. He didn't see me at first. He was looking down at a folder, murmuring something to the man beside him. "Let's get this over with," he said. When he finally looked up, he froze. His pen slipped from his hand, clattering softly against the table. For a heartbeat, we just stared at each other. "Claire," he said my name, breaking the air like glass. I nodded once. "Mr. Morgan." Color drained from his face. "You're the director they sent?" "I am," I said evenly. "Morgan Logistics is handling your restructuring." He took a half step back as if he needed distance to process what he was seeing. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thick with everything we'd never said. One of the other men coughed nervously. "Should we—" My father raised a hand. "No. Sit down." We both did. The silence was sharp enough to hurt. I spread the documents on the table, pointing to the sections that required his signature. "This plan keeps your assets intact while clearing 60% of the outstanding debt within 12 months. The state will cover the consulting fees through the recovery grant." He didn't look at the papers. He was looking at me. "You built this." "With a team," I replied. "But yes." He picked up the pen again, tapping it against the folder. "I don't understand. How did you—" I cut him off, my voice calm. "I didn't come here to talk about the past. This is business." His jaw clenched. "Claire, No," I said quietly. "You made your choice 10 years ago. I made mine. Today we both have work to do." He exhaled slowly, the sound somewhere between defeat and disbelief. "I'm not here for revenge," I added. "You once told me fairness has to be earned, not given. I believed you. That's why I'm sitting on this side of the table." For the first time, he couldn't meet my eyes. He looked down, studying the papers, like they were written in a language he no longer understood. His hand shook slightly as he signed each page. When he was done, he pushed the folder toward me without speaking. I gathered the documents, slid them neatly into my briefcase, and stood. "We'll start next month," I said. He nodded, still staring at the table. "You did well," he said finally. Barely audible. I didn't reply. Outside, the Ohio air was cold and gray. The sky hung low over the factory buildings, the metal roofs glistening faintly with frost. I walked past the chain-link fence where the old sign, Morgan Industrial, was missing 2 letters. That night, I drove through the neighborhood I hadn't seen in years. The streets looked smaller, the trees bare. When I turned the corner onto Maple Drive, my chest tightened. Our old house stood there, lights off, windows dark. The paint was peeling, and a weather-stained for sale sign leaned in the yard. The porch light, the one my mother used to leave on for Lauren, was dead. I sat in the car for a while, engine idling, watching the ghost of my childhood through the windshield. Part of me wanted to get out to walk up those steps and knock, but there was nothing left to say. The next morning, I learned from Jordan that my sister had moved back in after her divorce. 36, unemployed, starting over. The irony felt almost cruel. I imagined the scene. The same kitchen, the same worn chairs, my mother sitting across from Lauren, with a cup of tea between them. "You should apply to Morgan Logistics," she'd probably said. They're hiring. You have experience, and it's a good company. And Lauren, after a pause, might have answered softly, maybe. That afternoon, as I sat at my desk in Portland, the email arrived. Subject application, Lauren Morgan. I froze. Her name glowed on the screen, familiar yet strange. My fingers hovered over the mouse, unable to move. When I finally opened the file, her resume appeared. Clean, professional years of experience listed neatly. Leadership, communication, problem-solving. Words that once belonged to the version of her I could never compete with. I leaned back in my chair, eyes drifting up to the framed quote on my office wall. Fairness is something we earn. For a long time I didn't move. The hum of the city outside filled the silence. Somewhere deep down I felt something shift. Not anger, not triumph, just the quiet gravity of a circle closing. Then I turned off my screen, folded my hands on the desk, and let the stillness settle. The morning light spilled across the glass walls of the conference room, soft and clean. From where I sat, I could see the river glinting beyond the skyline, the city just beginning to wake. Everything about the office felt new. Fresh paint, polished floors, the quiet hum of computers, but I couldn't stop thinking about the name that had appeared on the interview schedule that morning. Lauren Morgan. I'd almost asked my assistant to handle it. Almost. But something in me refused to let someone else write the ending to this chapter. When the elevator doors opened, I saw her through the glass, still elegant in the way she carried herself, but thinner. Her confidence dulled around the edges. She hesitated at reception, adjusting her blazer, as if it could protect her from what she was about to walk into. I stayed seated, hands folded over the folder in front of me. The door opened with a soft click. "Good morning," I said, my voice even controlled. "Please have a seat." "We're here to discuss your qualifications." She froze just inside the doorway. "Claire," she whispered, barely audible. I didn't know." "I imagine you didn't," I replied. For a long second, she didn't move. Then she sat down slowly, clutching her portfolio in both hands, like it might keep her steady. Her eyes searched my face, trying to find the version of me she remembered. "I read about your company," she said. Finally, voice trembling slightly. "I just didn't—" "You didn't think it was mine?" I finished for her. "That's all right. Not many did." She tried to smile, but it faltered halfway. "You look different. I said. It's been more than a decade." I opened the folder, flipping to the first page of her resume. Everything was neat, efficient, just like her handwriting had always been. Leadership roles, volunteer work, managerial experience. It was impressive. She watched me read, waiting for something. Anger, accusation, anything. But I gave her nothing. So I said at last, keeping my tone professional, "Tell me about your experience managing teams. What do you believe makes a workplace fair?" Her eyes flickered, confused. "Fair. Yes," I said. "Fairness. You've been in management before. How do you make sure everyone gets what they deserve?" She hesitated. I think fairness means treating people equally. I repeated, glancing up. Or just comfortably. She blinked. "I don't understand what you mean." "Of course you do." The words hung there, quiet, but sharp enough to sting. For a moment I thought she might apologize, or at least acknowledge it. The years, the silence, the rain that night she watched me walk away. But she didn't. She just straightened her posture, trying to reclaim authority she no longer had. "I've changed," she said softly. "Life hasn't been easy. Few lives are," I said, "but we adapt." She looked down, fingers tightening around her folder. "I didn't know what happened to you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Mom and Dad, they thought you were doing fine." I smiled faintly, closing the folder. They thought wrong. Silence settled between us again, heavier this time. Outside, the sound of a passing truck echoed faintly from the street below. I leaned back, folding my hands. "You said you've changed. So have I. But this—" I gestured around us, the office, the company, the glass that framed the skyline. "This isn't about what we were. It's about what we've built since." Lauren nodded, eyes glossy. "You built something incredible," she said quietly. "I'm proud of you." The words caught me off guard. I didn't expect them. I didn't know what to do with them. "Thank you," I said finally. We sat in silence a moment longer. Then I looked her in the eye. "Fairness is something we earn, isn't it?" Her lips parted, but no sound came out. I wrote 2 words at the bottom of her file, candidate reviewed. When I stood, the interview was over. She did too, clutching her bag as if it anchored her to the floor. At the door, she turned back. "Claire," she said softly, do you hate me?" I met her gaze steady. "No, but you should learn how to stand on your own feet." Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She nodded once, opened the door, and walked out. When the sound of her heels faded down the hall, I leaned back in my chair. The late afternoon light spilled across the office, painting the walls gold. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of every moment that had led here. The rain, the bus stop, the hospital, the diner, the warehouse. I turned my chair toward the window. Outside, the city shimmered beneath the sun, quiet and alive. I pressed my palm against the cool glass and closed my eyes, breathing in the stillness. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like balance. 2 months passed quietly. The office ran like a machine now. Steady, reliable, efficient. My days were filled with meetings, numbers, logistics, charts, and the soft hum of people who finally believed they were building something solid. I worked the same hours, spoke less, and smiled when necessary. Success had a strange weight. It didn't feel like celebration, it felt like maintenance. Jordan stopped by my office one afternoon, knocking twice before letting himself in. "Got a minute?" he asked, holding a folder under his arm. His smile told me the news before his words did. "The case is over," he said. "The court ruled in your favor. You keep full ownership of Morgan Logistics. Daniel doesn't get a cent." For a long second, I just sat there. Then I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. "It's done," I murmured. Jordan nodded. "It's done." He hesitated, then added, "You handled it better than most would. You didn't let him see you bleed." I looked out the window where the afternoon light glowed faintly over the river. There was nothing left to bleed. He smiled softly, understanding more than I said. "You'll get the official paperwork by next week. Congratulations, Claire. You won." When he left, I sat alone, staring at the city below. The world had moved on from the noise of lawsuits and rumors, but the quiet that followed wasn't peace. It was something heavier, like gravity after flight. That evening, an email notification blinked on my screen. Internal training program. Acceptance notification. I opened it. The name at the top was Lauren Morgan. She had been accepted into Morgan Logistics entry-level operations training. A lower position. No title. No shortcuts. Just work. I stared at her name for a long time before closing the message. My assistant had sent it automatically, not knowing who she was. I didn't correct her. Later that night, as I was finishing reports, my phone buzzed. A voicemail from an unknown number. My mother's voice filled the room when I played it. "Claire, it's Mom. I just wanted to say how proud we are of you. Your father, too. He watched your interview on TV. He didn't say much, but I saw his eyes. You've made us proud, sweetheart." I listened to the message twice, then pressed delete. On the television in the corner of my office, a business channel was replaying the segment from that week's conference. The caption across the bottom read, "Young CEO revives Northwest logistics industry." The camera showed me on stage, standing behind a sleek podium, talking about rebuilding ethical supply systems. The shot zoomed in on my face, older now, calm, confident. Somewhere in Ohio, I imagined my parents watching that same image. Maybe my mother sitting on the couch tissues nearby. Maybe my father standing in the doorway, silent as ever. I could almost hear him say it, not loudly, not proudly, but with the soft humility of a man who'd finally seen what he'd lost. She's done greater things than any of us expected. The thought didn't hurt the way it once would have. It just settled somewhere deep inside, like closure wearing quiet clothes. A week later, I finished late and decided to drive home instead of calling a car. The highway was empty, the lights stretching endlessly ahead. When I reached the old industrial district, I slowed down. The sign caught my eye first, Ruth's Diner still glowing faint yellow against the night. I hadn't been there in years. I pulled over. Inside, the place looked almost the same. The smell of coffee and fried onions wrapped around me like an old song. The counter stools were still mismatched, the chalkboard still listing specials of the day in looping handwriting. Behind the counter stood Ruth, her hair more silver than I remembered, her movements slower but steady. She looked up, squinting, and when she recognized me, her mouth curved into a grin. "Well, look who walked in," she said. "I knew you'd come back someday. Just didn't expect it in heels and a fancy coat." I laughed softly. "You still remember me?" Hard to forget the girl who organized my entire pantry by expiration date, she said, wiping her hands on her apron. You made my mornings too quiet when you left. I sat at the counter, the stool squeaking the same way it used to. I always meant to visit. She poured coffee into a chipped mug and slid it toward me. You're here now. That's what matters. The warmth of it seeped into my hands. For a while, neither of us spoke. The sound of the radio filled the silence, an old blues song about roads and second chances. She glanced at the papers sticking out of my bag. You running your own show now? I smiled. Something like that. I saw your face in the paper a few months back, she said. Didn't think it could be the same kid who used to count my ketchup bottles. People grow up, I said quietly. Ruth leaned on the counter, studying me. Some people just grow. You were always that type. I looked around the diner. The chipped tables, the flickering neon, the walls that had seen more lives start over than anyone would ever know. This place hasn't changed. Why would it? Ruth said, It's already fair. I laughed softly. You always did have a way of making sense out of everything. She patted my hand. You always did have a way of making sense out of everyone else. When I left, the sign outside flickered once the letters buzzing in the cool night air. As I stood by my car, I looked back through the window. Ruth was refilling a customer's cup, smiling in that patient, familiar way. She was right. I hadn't come back for nostalgia. I'd come back because this was where I'd first learned that hard work was louder than apology, and that dignity was something you built piece by piece. When I drove off, the glow of the diner shrank in my rearview mirror until it looked like a star. I whispered to myself, I'm still keeping my promise. The road ahead was dark, but open, the city lights pulling me forward quiet and steady as the hum of the engine. The sun was just starting to set over Portland when the glass facade of Morgan Logistics caught the light and turned it gold. From the outside, the building looked alive, banners rippling in the wind, music echoing faintly from the open doors. Inside, laughter and applause floated through the air as employees, partners, and friends gathered to celebrate 10 years since the company began. 10 years since I'd walked out of a tiny apartment with a folder full of roots and one impossible idea. I walked through the main hallway, my heels clicking softly against the polished floor. On the wall to my right hung 3 things behind glass. A plastic hospital bracelet stamped unknown address, a faded $20 bill sealed in a frame, and a small metal plaque engraved with the words, "Fairness is something we earn." I stopped in front of them. Every time I passed this wall, I remembered the cold rain, the smell of diesel, the bench at the bus stop, and how small the world had felt back then. Tonight, the lights reflected off the glass, and I saw my own face layered over those relics. Older, steadier, but still the same girl underneath. Behind me, a quiet voice said, "You still keep those here." I turned. Lauren stood a few feet away wearing a navy blazer with the company pin on her lapel. Her hair was shorter now, her posture humbler. She looked at the bracelet and the bill, then at me. "Do you hate me?" she asked softly. I shook my head. "No. Hate keeps us tied to the past." She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. "I didn't deserve this job." "You earned the chance to try again," I said. "That's all any of us ever get." For a moment, we just stood there, 2 women who'd once been girls in the same house but on opposite sides of everything. She wiped her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Before I could answer, a voice from the conference hall called, "Ms. Morgan, we're ready for you." I smiled at her one last time and walked toward the sound. The ballroom was bright, filled with hundreds of people. The stage lights hit my eyes as I stepped up to the podium. The crowd quieted their faces, turning toward me. The drivers, the coordinators, the interns, the partners. All the people who had made this company more than a name. I took a breath. 10 years ago, I began. I sat at a bus stop in the rain holding a $20 bill and wondering if anyone would ever trust me with a future. Tonight, I stand here not because of revenge or luck, but because of work. Because of the belief that fairness isn't handed down. It's built piece by people who refuse to give up. The room was silent. Cameras flashed in the back. I looked over the crowd and saw Lauren sitting in the front row. She met my eyes and smiled, small and tremulous, the kind that said she finally understood what words could never fix. When I started Morgan Logistics, I continued. I didn't want to build an empire. I wanted to build balance, a place where no one was invisible, where the person sweeping the floor mattered as much as the person signing the check. because fairness isn't just policy, it's practice. Applause rippled through the room, steady and genuine. I glanced down once more at my notes, but didn't need them. The rest came from somewhere deeper. "We're all builders," I said, "of companies, of families, of second chances, and if tonight proves anything, it's that what once broke us can also shape us into something stronger." When the applause swelled again, I stepped back, letting it wash over me, not as validation, but as sound proof that the world I'd built had weight and warmth. After the ceremony, as the crowd thinned and the lights dimmed, I slipped outside. The evening air was cool, the last glow of sunlight sliding down the river. From the terrace, I could see the city stretched out alive with motion. I leaned on the railing, listening to the faint rhythm of traffic, the pulse of the place I had once thought was too big for me. Inside, music started again, my employees dancing, laughing, living. For the first time in a long time, I felt still. I looked out at the water, the reflection of the skyline shimmering like a promise, and spoke quietly the words more to myself than anyone else. Fairness isn't something we're given, it's something we earn, with every late night, every choice to keep going, every time we refuse to disappear. The wind carried the sound away, gentle and final. Then, as if out of instinct, I smiled and added softly, "Have you ever had to earn your own fairness? Tell me your city. Maybe you're building yours too." And with that, I turned toward the light spilling from the building behind me, toward the sound of my people, my company, my story still unfolding, and walked back inside.